Leonid Shulman. On January 30th, 2022, just weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, the 60-year-old head of transport at Gazprom Invest was found dead in his bathroom. His wrists had been slashed. A suicide note was nearby. He lived in a wealthy gated community known as Gazprom's Nest near St. Petersburg. This wasn't just any neighborhood. It was where Gazprom housed its most valuable employees, its most trusted insiders. The official story said he killed himself due to complications from a fractured leg. A fractured leg. That was the explanation given to the public. But there was more beneath the surface. The Moscow Post reported that Shulman was under investigation for embezzling funds from Gazprom through fraudulent orders and inflated service prices. Internal audits showed identical repair purchases made 2 months apart, each costing 1.2 million rubles. The same repair, the same price, 2 months apart. That was theft from Gazprom. And here's what you need to understand about stealing from Gazprom. In Russia, Gazprom is not just a company. It is a state within a state. It controls Europe's energy supply. It funds the Kremlin's operations. It is Putin's piggy bank. Putin allegedly owns 4.5% of the company as part of his hidden fortune, estimated at around $200 billion. When you steal from Gazprom, you are not stealing from shareholders or investors. You are stealing directly from Vladimir Putin himself. Shulman knew the transportation contracts inside and out. He knew which companies got the deals. He knew which prices were inflated. He knew where the money went after it left Gazprom's accounts. That knowledge made him valuable. It also made him dangerous. Whether Shulman took his own life out of fear, knowing what was coming for him, or whether someone decided he knew too much and made it look like suicide, his death was the first domino to fall. The fracture in his leg may have been real, but the fracture in the system he represented was about to split wide open. Alexander Tyulikov. Less than a month later, on February 25th, 2022, the very day after Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, another Gazprom executive was found dead. 61-year-old Alexander Tyulikov was discovered hanging in his garage. Like Shulman, he lived in the same Gazprom Nest community near St. Petersburg. 2 men, same company, same gated neighborhood. Dead within weeks of each other. Tyulikov had worked for Gazprom for a decade, but before that, he had spent more than 20 years in the KGB and FSB, Russia's intelligence services. This was not a man who stumbled into the energy business. This was a man placed there. A suicide note was found next to his body. It was neat. It was convenient. It explained everything, according to the official account. But witnesses reported something unusual. Tyulikov had come home bruised and beaten the day before his death. Novaya Gazeta, one of Russia's few remaining independent newspapers, reported that he was seen severely battered before he died. His face was swollen. His body showed signs of trauma. When Gazprom's private security arrived at the scene, they did something extraordinary. They pushed local police investigators out of the area and cordoned off the crime scene themselves. Let that sink in. A corporate security team taking control of a death investigation, blocking law enforcement, securing evidence before anyone else could examine it. That interference raised immediate suspicions. Why would a company send its security team to take over a suicide investigation? What were they protecting? Or who? When reporters later requested images of Tyulikov from Gazprom for their stories, they discovered all photos had been systematically removed from company files and databases. It was as if Gazprom wanted to erase him from memory, as if his face, his identity, his very existence was now a liability. Investigative journalists from Novaya Gazeta and Transparency International later connected Tyulikov's death to a massive fraud scheme involving Montenegro's Imperio hotel project. The scheme was elegant in its corruption. Money would be funneled from multi-billion-dollar Gazprom contracts into a network of shell companies and businesses owned by friends and family members, with direct ties to the FSB and Russian military. These were not random business partners. These were the people who mattered in Putin's Russia. The people who could move money without questions. The people who had protection. Tyulikov's career path mirrored that of others involved in the fraud. KGB and FSB service, followed by a lucrative position in the energy sector. It was a well-worn road for Russian intelligence officers looking to cash in on their connections. His job was to facilitate the contracts, to sign off on the deals, to make sure the money flowed to the right people. His death silenced a man who knew exactly where the money went. He knew the names. He knew the accounts. He knew which oligarchs were getting rich off Gazprom's books, and which intelligence officers were taking their cut. The day after Russia invaded Ukraine, Tyulikov was found hanging in his garage. The timing was not coincidental. War changes everything. Secrets that were manageable before become dangerous. People who were useful become liabilities. Tyulikov knew too much at the worst possible time. Mikhail Watford. 3 days after Tyulikov's death, on February 28th, Ukrainian-born Russian billionaire Mikhail Watford was found hanged in the garage of his Surrey home in the United Kingdom. His wife and children were home at the time. They were unharmed. They heard nothing. They saw nothing. Watford had made his fortune in oil and gas after the fall of the Soviet Union, during the chaotic privatization years when state assets were carved up and sold off to those with the right connections. He was born with the last name Tolstoshaya, but changed it after moving to the UK in the early 2000s. The name change was part of his reinvention. A new country, a new identity, a new life built on Russian oil money. He was 66 years old and had built a considerable property empire in London, owning luxury apartments and commercial buildings in some of the city's most expensive districts. He was reportedly a member of Putin's inner circle, one of the billionaires who had direct access to the Kremlin and direct ties to the president himself. Surrey police investigated the death, but stated there were no suspicious circumstances at the time. The death was treated as unexplained but not suspicious. That phrasing is important. Unexplained but not suspicious. It means they had no clear answers, but also no immediate evidence of foul play. The timing, however, was striking. Just days after the invasion began, a billionaire with deep Kremlin ties dies in his garage, while his family remains unharmed in the same house. His death came at a moment when Western sanctions were being announced against Russian businessmen. Assets were being frozen, accounts were being locked, properties were being seized. Watford knew his fortune was about to be targeted. He knew the UK government would come for his properties, his bank accounts, his carefully constructed financial empire. But he also knew something else. He knew which UK politicians and businessmen had accepted Russian money over the years. He knew which shell companies were used to move oligarch cash into London real estate. He knew which law firms and banks had helped launder the money. That knowledge made him valuable to Western investigators. It also made him a threat to people on both sides. Whether Watford killed himself because he saw no way out, or whether someone decided he was too much of a risk, the result was the same. A man who could have told investigators everything about Russian money in London was found dead in his garage days after the war started. His family was spared, but his secrets died with him. Vasily Melnikov. On March 23, 2022, 43-year-old billionaire Vasily Melnikov was found dead in his luxury apartment in Nizhny Novgorod, alongside his wife and 2 young sons aged 4 and 10. All 4 had been stabbed to death. Investigators concluded that Melnikov killed his wife and children before taking his own life. There were no signs of unauthorized entry into the apartment. The doors were locked from the inside. Knives were found at the scene and seized as evidence. The official narrative was clear. This was a domestic incident, a family tragedy, a man who snapped under pressure and committed the unthinkable. But neighbors and relatives struggled to believe the official story. They said it was unthinkable that Melnikov would harm his family. He was a devoted father. He adored his sons. He had no history of violence or mental instability. Melnikov was the head of Medstom, a medical supplies company that had grown successful supplying equipment to Russian hospitals and clinics. The firm had suffered immensely after Western sanctions were imposed following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. International suppliers cut ties. Payment systems were blocked. Contracts were canceled overnight. Reports indicated the company was on the verge of collapse. Debts were mounting. Creditors were demanding payment. The business that Melnikov had built over years was crumbling in weeks. The family had just returned from a holiday in the Maldives when their bodies were discovered. They had been enjoying luxury beaches and five-star resorts just days before they were found stabbed to death in their apartment. For investigators, the explanation was financial stress and domestic violence. A man facing ruin who decided if he couldn't have his family and his life, then no one would. For those who knew him, the explanation did not fit the man they remembered. Melnikov was a problem solver, a businessman who had navigated the chaos of Russian commerce for years. This was not someone who gave up. But there's another possibility that investigators never publicly explored. Melnikov's medical supply company had contracts with state hospitals and military facilities. He knew which supplies were being ordered in unusual quantities. He knew which facilities were preparing for mass casualties. He may have known about the invasion before it happened. He may have known Russia was stockpiling medical supplies for war. That knowledge, shared with the wrong people or threatened to be shared with Western intelligence, could have made him a target. The scene was staged to look like a murder-suicide. The locked door, the knives, the absence of forced entry. It all pointed to Melnikov as the killer. But staging a crime scene is not difficult for professionals. And in Putin's Russia, there are plenty of professionals. 4 people died in that apartment. Only one of them was a threat to powerful people. The other 3 were collateral damage. Vladislav Avayev. On April 18, 2022, 51-year-old Vladislav Avayev was found dead in his multi-million-dollar Moscow apartment on Universitetsky Prospect, one of the city's most prestigious addresses. His wife and 13-year-old daughter were found dead alongside him. A gun was in his hand. The official investigation concluded it was a murder-suicide. There were no signs of anyone else having been in the apartment. The door was locked from the inside. Shell casings matched the weapon in Avayev's hand. A relative discovered the bodies after the family driver and nanny could not reach them by phone for hours. When they finally convinced building security to open the door, the scene was already cold. Avayev had been the former vice president of Gazprom Bank, Russia's third-largest bank, which services the energy giant Gazprom. Before that, he had been a Kremlin official working in financial oversight. His job at Gazprom Bank involved private banking for VIP clients, not ordinary wealthy people. VIP clients in Russia means oligarchs, Kremlin insiders, people close to Putin himself. He managed very large amounts of money. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars moving through accounts he controlled or had visibility into. Igor Volobuev, a former vice president of Gazprom Bank who left Russia for Ukraine after the invasion, spoke to CNN about his former colleague. He was blunt in his assessment. Volobuev stated that he did not believe Avayev killed himself. He said Avayev dealt with VIP clients and was in charge of very large sums. He suggested Avayev knew something and posed some kind of danger. That statement was never officially investigated. The case was closed as a domestic incident within days. But think about what Volobuev was saying. Avayev had access to the financial records of Russia's most powerful people. He knew which accounts held the money. He knew how funds were moved to avoid sanctions. He knew which shell companies were being used. He knew where Putin's money was hidden. In the weeks after the invasion, Western governments were scrambling to track and freeze Russian assets. Banks were being pressured to reveal oligarch accounts. Financial investigators were following money trails. Avayev could have been approached by Western intelligence. He could have been threatened by Russian security services. He could have been caught between two sides, each demanding his cooperation. Or he could have simply known too much and been eliminated before he became a problem. His wife and daughter were killed too. Why? If this was really a man having a mental breakdown, why execute his family first? The more likely explanation is that they were home when it happened. They saw who came to the door. They heard the conversations. They became witnesses who had to be silenced. The gun in Avayev's hand told a story, but it may not have been his story, Sergei Protosenya. Just one day later, on April 19th, 2022, the body of 55-year-old Sergei Protosenya was found hanged outside a rented villa in Lloret de Mar, a coastal town in Spain. His wife and 18-year-old daughter were found stabbed to death in their beds inside the villa. An axe and a knife were discovered next to Protosenya's body. The family had been on holiday for Easter, enjoying the Spanish coast in a rented luxury villa far from the chaos unfolding in Russia. Protosenya had accumulated a net worth of more than $433 million over his career in Russia's energy sector. He had worked for Novatek, Russia's largest independent natural gas producer, from 1997 until 2015. That was 18 years at one of the most important energy companies in Russia. He had risen through the ranks to become chief accountant and deputy chairman of the board. He knew every detail of Novatek's finances, every contract, every deal, every off-the-books payment. Catalan police investigated two possible scenarios. Either Protosenya killed his wife and daughter in their sleep, then walked outside and hanged himself from the villa's terrace, or all three were murdered, and the crime scene was staged to look like a murder-suicide. Protosenya's son, who was not in Spain when the deaths occurred, stated publicly that his father was not a murderer. He believed his parents and sister were murdered by someone else. He pointed to details that didn't make sense. His father had no history of violence. The family was happy. They were on vacation. There was no fight, no argument, no warning signs. Novatek, Protosenya's former employer, released a statement casting doubt on the murder-suicide theory. They said the speculation was not related to reality. That's a remarkable statement for a Russian energy company to make. They were essentially saying their former executive did not kill his family. They were contradicting the official police narrative. Why would they do that unless they knew something? The timing was the detail that stopped people cold. Two high-ranking energy executives, Avayev and Protosenya, found dead with their families within 24 hours of each other. Both deaths ruled as murder-suicides. Both men with access to enormous sums of money and insider knowledge of Russia's energy empire. Both men who could have told Western investigators exactly how Russian energy money flows, where it goes, and who profits from it. The odds of two such men, in two different countries, both killing their families and themselves within 24 hours by pure coincidence, are astronomically low. Someone was sending a message. And that message was being heard by every other executive in Russia's energy sector who might be thinking about talking to Western authorities. Alexander Subotin. On May 8, 2022, 43-year-old Alexander Subotin was found dead in the basement of a house in Mytishchi, a city just outside Moscow. He was a former top manager at Lukoil, Russia's second-largest oil company. He had been a board member before leaving to become owner of the new transport company, a logistics firm. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the circumstances were bizarre, even by Russian standards. Subotin had visited a local shaman named Magua, whose real name was Alexei Pindurin, along with the shaman's wife. They reportedly offered high-paying clients various unorthodox treatments for ailments ranging from hangovers to chronic pain. One treatment involved poisonous toad venom. The process was disturbing. The shamans would make an incision in the client's skin, drip toad poison directly into the wound, and wait for the client to start vomiting violently. After the vomiting stopped, clients allegedly would feel better, cleansed of toxins. According to reports, Sabatin had arrived at the house in a state of severe alcohol and drug intoxication the day before his death. He had been seeking treatment for a brutal hangover. He wanted to feel better quickly. He trusted these shamans enough to let them cut his skin and poison him. During the session, he suddenly felt unwell. His chest hurt. His heart was racing. He told them he was in pain. The shaman decided not to call an ambulance. Instead, he gave Sabatin heart drops, some kind of herbal remedy, and put him to sleep in the basement. The basement was reportedly used for Jamaican voodoo rituals. What that means exactly is unclear, but it suggests the shamans were involved in more than just toad venom treatments. That was where Sabatin's body was found the next morning. Cold. Dead. Lying in a basement used for rituals while shamans upstairs tried to figure out what to do. When police arrived, the shamans told them they were just friends of the deceased. They downplayed their role. They minimized what had happened. A criminal investigation was opened. Authorities tested Sabatin's blood for traces of drugs and poisons. Whether he died from toad poison, a heart attack, or something else remains officially unclear. But here's what doesn't make sense. Alexander Sabatin was a wealthy, sophisticated former oil executive. He had access to the best medical care in Moscow. If he needed help with a hangover or substance abuse, he could have gone to a private clinic with trained doctors. Instead, he went to a house in Mytishchi to be treated by shamans who cut him and poisoned him with toad venom. Why? Was he really that desperate? Or was he told to go there? Was he lured to that house under false pretenses? The pattern holds. Another oil executive with ties to Lukoil, dead under strange circumstances, with questions that outweigh answers. Sabatin knew about Lukoil's transport contracts. He knew which logistics companies got the deals and why. He knew how much oil was really being moved and where it was going, especially after sanctions made official exports difficult. That knowledge made him dangerous, and dangerous people in Russia's energy sector kept dying. Yuri Voronov. On July 4th, 2022, 61-year-old businessman Yuri Voronov was found dead in the swimming pool of his luxury home in St. Petersburg. He had a gunshot wound to the head. A pistol was found next to his body, floating in the water. Voronov was the head of a logistics company that held lucrative contracts with Gazprom for work in the Arctic region, one of the most strategically important areas for Russia's energy future. The Arctic holds vast reserves of natural gas and oil. Gazprom has been developing these fields for decades, building pipelines and facilities in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Voronov's company handled the logistics, moving equipment, transporting workers, supplying remote facilities. It was unglamorous work, but it was essential and extremely profitable. Investigators attributed the death to a dispute with business partners. That explanation was tidy but thin. What kind of business dispute ends with a man shot in the head in his own swimming pool? Was it a meeting gone wrong? A confrontation that escalated? Or was the dispute just a convenient cover story? The official record shows a successful businessman found dead with a gun. The unofficial whispers pointed to the contracts he managed and the money that flowed through his company. Friends and business associates struggled with the suicide conclusion. They described a man engaged in future projects, actively planning expansions and new deals. This was not someone on the edge of despair. Voronov knew about Gazprom's Arctic operations in detail. He knew which projects were real and which were inflated for budget purposes. He knew who was skimming money from the contracts. He knew too much, and by July 2022, the pattern was clear. People in Russia's energy sector who knew too much were dying. The death added another name to a list that was growing too long to ignore. Ravil Maganov. On September 1st, 2022, 67-year-old Ravil Maganov fell from a sixth-floor hospital window in Moscow. He was the chairman of Lukoil, Russia's largest privately owned oil and gas company, one of the most powerful men in Russian energy, a man with connections at the highest levels. The company confirmed his death, but said only that he passed away following severe illness. They made no mention of a fall, no mention of a window, just a vague statement about illness. Russian state news agency TASS reported the incident differently. They cited a police source saying Maganov had committed suicide by jumping from the hospital window. But there were complicating factors that made this death different from all the others. Earlier in 2022, Lukoil had taken the unusual and dangerous public stance of speaking out against Russia's war in Ukraine. The company's board called for sympathy for the victims and for an end to the conflict. That was a rare and extraordinarily dangerous position for a major Russian company to take. In Putin's Russia, you don't publicly oppose the war. You don't call for it to end. You certainly don't express sympathy for Ukrainian victims while Russian soldiers are dying. Lukoil did exactly that, and Maganov, as chairman, would have approved that statement. Maganov's death was the most publicized in a string of accidental self-defenestrations, a fancy term for falling out of windows. The term itself became darkly ironic. Falling from windows is a recurring theme in Russian political deaths going back decades. It's a signature method. The hospital fall, the company's anti-war stance, and the official silence about the circumstances created a narrative gap. That gap filled with suspicion immediately. Was Maganov pushed? Was he thrown? Did he really jump? He was in the hospital for a heart condition, reportedly serious enough to require treatment, but not immediately life-threatening. Why would a man recovering from heart problems, surrounded by medical staff, decide to climb out a sixth-floor window? The hospital had cameras. There were witnesses. Medical staff would have seen him walking toward the window, but none of that information was ever made public. The case was closed quickly. Lukoil stopped talking about it. The government said nothing more. Maganov had been chairman of one of Russia's most valuable companies. His death should have been investigated thoroughly. Instead, it was swept away in a matter of days. The message was clear. Speaking against the war, even mildly, even as a major company, comes with consequences. Ivan Pechorin. On September 12, 2022, 39-year-old Ivan Pechorin was found dead in Vladivostok after allegedly falling off his luxury yacht. He drowned in the Sea of Japan near Cape Ignatieff. His body was recovered 2 days after he went into the water. Pechorin was the managing director for the aviation industry at the Corporation for the Development of the Far East and the Arctic. He worked directly under Putin on strategic development projects. He had been tasked with modernizing Russia's aviation industry, a massive undertaking, especially after Western sanctions cut off access to parts, technology, and international cooperation. Days before his death, he had participated in the Russian East Economic Forum, a major government event where officials present plans and strategies for developing Russia's eastern regions. There, Pechorin presented a strategic plan to develop the Far East and overcome Western sanctions. He talked about import substitution, domestic production, and new partnerships with Asian countries. He was optimistic, he was detailed, he laid out timelines and goals. This was not a man preparing to die. The official story was an accident. He fell from his yacht while intoxicated and drowned. Rescue attempts failed. The water was cold. He was alone. It was tragic. But the timing raised questions. A high-ranking official with direct Putin ties, working on strategic sanctions evasion, dies just days after presenting his plans publicly. He knew which aviation projects were real and which were propaganda. He knew which Russian companies couldn't actually produce what they claimed. He knew where the sanctions were hitting hardest. He also knew which foreign companies were secretly helping Russia evade sanctions through third countries and shell companies. That information would be extremely valuable to Western intelligence services trying to enforce sanctions and cut off Russia's access to critical technology. The corporation released a statement calling his death tragic. It offered no additional details, no explanation for how a 39-year-old man in good health fell off his own yacht and drowned. Friends and colleagues pointed to his scheduled projects and future collaborations. Meetings were booked. Plans were in motion. He had every reason to live. But he died anyway, in cold water off the Russian coast, alone on his yacht. Conclusion. So that's the list. 10 deaths in 8 months. Leonid Shulman, Alexander Tulikov, Mikhail Watford, Vasily Melnikov, Vladislav Avayev, Sergei Protosenya, Alexander Subotin, Yuri Voronov, Ravil Maganov, Ivan Pechorin. Most worked for Gazprom, Lukoil, or Novatek. Most had access to enormous sums of money. Most knew details about contracts, corruption networks, and financial flows that reached directly into the Kremlin itself. The official explanations include suicide, murder-suicide, accident, heart failure, poisoning, and falls from windows and yachts. Each case alone might be dismissed as tragic but ordinary. A depressed executive, a domestic dispute, a drunken accident. Together, they form a pattern that investigators, journalists, and international observers cannot ignore. Investigative reports by Novaya Gazeta revealed that some deaths were connected to large-scale accounting fraud by Gazprom executives. Money was being systematically funneled to businesses owned by friends and family, with direct ties to the FSB and Russian military intelligence. These weren't small amounts. We're talking about billions of rubles over years, siphoned from state contracts and energy deals flowing into private pockets. Businessman Bill Browder, a prominent critic of Putin and former Russia investor, stated publicly that he believes Putin personally orders executions of business leaders in critical sectors who might not be yes-men. Browder knows how the system works. His lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, died in Russian custody after exposing government corruption. Browder has spent years tracking Russian money and Russian methods. In Russia, this practice is called mokroye delo, wet work. It's an old KGB term for assassinations and murders that leave blood behind. According to Browder and other experts, the way it works is simple but effective. People are given a choice. Commit suicide quietly, and your family will be protected and financially secure. Refuse, and you and your family will receive a visitation. Everyone dies. The choice is yours. The phenomenon has been called sudden Russian death syndrome or sudden oligarch death syndrome. It's a dark play on sudden cardiac death, the medical term for unexpected heart failure. But there's nothing sudden or natural about these deaths. Friends and families of the deceased generally found it unthinkable that these men killed themselves, and in some cases murdered their wives and children first. They have demanded independent investigations. They have questioned official narratives. They have spoken to international media. Those investigations have not materialized. Cases are closed quickly, usually within days. Evidence disappears. Witnesses go quiet. Documents are sealed. The energy industry in Russia is not just business. It is power itself. Gazprom alone is a geopolitical tool used to pressure Europe through energy dependence. It is a source of Putin's hidden wealth, with billions flowing through it annually. It is a lever of control over European governments that rely on Russian gas. When executives in that system die in rapid succession, during a war, right when Western sanctions are being imposed and international investigators are trying to track Russian money, it sends a message. The message is not subtle. Talk, and you die. Cooperate with Western authorities, and you die. Know too much at the wrong time, and you die. Whether the deaths were staged assassinations, real suicides driven by fear and threats, or a mix of both, the result is the same. Silence. The secrets these men carried about, contracts, corruption, money laundering, and the true ownership of Russia's energy wealth died with them. What remains is a list of names, a timeline that tracks perfectly with the invasion of Ukraine, and a set of unanswered questions that will never be resolved in Russian courts. The pattern is the thing that people talk about late at night when they compare notes and find the same shape of events repeating. That pattern is what keeps this story alive. Because 10 men dying in 8 months, all from the same industry, all with access to sensitive information, all at the exact moment when that information became most dangerous, is not a coincidence. It's a purge,